We're now going to turn to our question period. So I'll be moderating by reading questions that are submitted to the Google form. So be sure to submit if you've got one. I have some questions that were submitted from folks watching the recorded lecture ahead of time. So I'll start with those. And I will sometimes, so if I see repeated questions, I'll combine them. And so, you know, if your question might be, sound a little different than when than exactly the way you wrote it. And we'll get to as many questions as we're able to. Professor Brading is kind enough to be calling in from the East Coast. So we're going to wrap up at 6:45. Okay, so the first question is, you've argued that in order to analyze collisions in the 18th century, physicists needed resources that weren't available from either philosophy or from mathematics. And the question is just, could you say more about exactly what these resources are that philosophy was unable to supply to solve these problems?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thank you all for being here. And thank you for this opportunity. Yeah, there are two different kinds of resources. So one is just a lack of principles by which to be able to handle the complicated motions that are involved when you have an extended body. So this is something that the people in mechanics were realizing, that they weren't getting enough out of Newton's Principia to be able to handle it. They were needing new principles kind of governing the behavior of matter and new ways of thinking about matter in order to be able to handle the behaviors of regions of extended matter. But you might think, well, we can just, eventually we'll just get that from the mathematical side. So that's not really a problem for the philosophers. But on the philosophical side, the philosophers, if we're going to handle extended bodies, then we want a material account. That's part of what the requirements are from philosophy. And it's not clear what kind of material account that's going to be, whether it's a continuum, whether it's an atomist approach. So there are different possibilities for an underlying matter theory, none of which themselves seem to be capable of giving us the resources to be able to account for collisions. And so there are the material resources in terms of, what do we need in order to have a collision process? What kind of an underlying matter theory would enable us to construct bodies that could undergo collisions? There's that. And then there's the third kind of resource, which you would want to come from philosophy if physics was going to stay within philosophy. And that would be the criteria for success, what counts as providing a successful theory of collision. And the philosophy just seems to be really struggling with that. It's kind of said, these are the things that we need, but been unable to supply it, and doesn't really have anywhere to draw on to change those criteria. So those are the kinds of places where I see the sort of inadequacies and the difficulties with pursuing physics what physics is becoming, as it were, from within philosophy. Does that, I don't know who asked this, so I would like to say, does that make sense? And does that help? I don't know who to look at.
They're coming in anonymous, so I don't know either. But so there's a follow-up also, which is, why didn't the natural philosophers adapt to the information now coming in from physics and updating the kinds of approaches that philosophers were taking to thinking about bodies? So why didn't philosophy change in such a way to keep physics within philosophy?
So obviously things are not as clean and clear cut. As I've said, I've been very kind of this physics and this philosophy and this mathematics, and there's these separate, obviously it's not as simple as that. And so there are going to be people who will try to adapt. But the key thing that I wanted to hold on to was that for the purpose of philosophy as a whole, for those purposes, we need to recover these macro-sized objects. These are the things that we just want to take for granted for all these other projects in philosophy that we have. And so there are philosophers who are trying to adapt, but that gap between the bodies that the rest of philosophy needs and what these other philosophers are working on just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So they are no longer really tied to philosophy either, and they become part of what's going to be physics, I think, but I haven't looked carefully at the 19th century yet. So, yeah.
Okay, the next question. So this is a historical question. You said at the beginning of the talk that the split between physics and philosophy didn't happen before Newton's Principia. And so the question is then, why does, as you say, Newton's Principia get folded into physics when we retell the history, rather than it being on the philosophy side if the split happens afterwards?
So there are a lot of sort of social and political reasons for this in the way that Newton was used in the 18th century rhetorically for power battles. But I also think there are very good philosophical reasons for this. So Newton's Principia is a beautifully structured book that has in it both a mechanics and a physics. So Newton well understood that there's the mathematical mechanics and there's the physics of causes. And then you need to bring these together somehow. This is, partly Galileo's project. There's this, struggle to figure out how to do this that goes on through the 17th century. And in the Principia, he brings these two things together and attempts to do a philosophical physics for the specific case of gravitation. And we all know that he was criticized for limitations in this, for limitations in the physics, where people thought that he had failed to supply and kind of cause an adequate causal account of how gravitation acts. So as we look back, this, it's just an incredible text in and of its own right for everything that he achieves. But aside just from that, just philosophically, the achievement there is, I think, is this attempted unification, and the extent to which that's the places where it fails in the causal story are the kinds of things that we just let go of when we move forward with a physics that's more autonomous from the demands of philosophy. So it makes good sense with hindsight. So what was a surprise to me was, okay, let's work this story forward, how long it takes for this to actually happen in practice. Given looking back, it just looks kind of obvious that this is a hugely important text for this split.
Okay. The next question. So your lecture makes clear why the theory of collisions at the time, I think this is supposed to be, didn't satisfy philosophical conceptions of what an adequate theory of physics required. How would this look, look from the perspective of mathematics as a discipline at this time? Did they see a physics that seemed to satisfy what would have been their conception? I take it the mathematicians' conception of an adequate physics.
I'm not sure if I understood the question right, so I will try to answer, and then if whoever asked that is around, they can maybe message Ben if it's not answering your question. So this would be an oversimplification, but roughly speaking, the mathematicians at the turn of the century are in a position to assume that there are these general bodies. We know roughly what they are. Philosophy, physics within philosophy provides us with that, and we can treat some of these properties mathematically and get on with things. But already by the beginning of the 18th century, in the wake of Newton's Principia, and other work that's being done on the continent in mechanics at the time, there are attempts with the development of the calculus, there are attempts to solve more problems in mechanics that have been solved before, to expand the domain of mechanics. And it's kind of becoming clear that we don't have enough resources mathematically to do that. And that because of that, we need to have a better understanding of the kind of the material systems that we're involved with. So you see these discussions of things that will, so the Vis-Viva controversy, which you may know about. So this idea that there might be this living force associated with bodies and what the correct measure of that is and whether or not it's conserved. Part of that is about what principles can we use in order to get problems set up well enough that we can solve them mathematically and connect it to what's going on empirically. So there's always this, the lever is there's practical applications of these things. It's not that it's completely detached from the natural world. It's just that a lever is a body and we have an account of bodies. I'm just going to treat some of the properties of bodies that are useful for other purposes if I'm doing the mathematics and the mechanics. Now I really lost my thread and I'm not sure I answered at all what was being asked. Maybe you should repeat the question. I don't know.
I think that's at least in part an answer. Let me find, I'm scrolling through the list of questions to try to organize them by theme. So the question was, did the mathematicians see, and I think this is referring to, you know, a theory of bodies that would have satisfied them in the 18th century already?
Did the math, so to some extent, some of them didn't care because they just want to solve mathematical problems. And then we saw Euler as an example of somebody who was part of a community where he had to have discussions with people who are much more kind of philosophers than metaphysicians. And they're arguing over territory. You know, he sees these people trying to recover various laws of motion and state what the principles are, that which conservation principles hold in the world and which ones can be violated. And yeah, and he's like, well, actually, I can tell you that. I have authority over these things. I'm solving problems and doing work that can answer that. So yeah, to the extent to which they care is the extent to which there's this overlap in territory, because they both share a common subject matter. Bodies are their common subject matter, and who gets to decide, who has authority over which aspects of that subject matter is about to be in big dispute.
The next question is about something that you didn't mention as a major factor in the split between physics and philosophy. So you didn't say much about the role of physical laws, like Newton's laws, in the split. And so the question is, were physical laws in the territory of philosophy, or what eventually split off as physics?
Good, that's a nice question. So this, yeah, absolutely starts off in philosophy. And even after Newton's Principia, we might think, oh, Newton's laws, got the laws, at least those are established, but that's not the case. People are giving different versions of the laws, looking at whether you can derive these laws from other principles, this kind of thing, and whether, yeah, what's the epistemic status of these laws and how do you get to them was one of the big questions at the time. And that was something that philosophers worked on, trying to articulate a notion of laws that comes out of the theory of matter. It's because matter has this nature that these are the laws that govern the behavior of matter. And now you can take those laws if you want and go off and do something in mechanics, if you like, but the laws have to come out of, have a material basis, a material reason why they're there, for example. But again, this is what's super interesting with Newton, right? He's got the same set of principles that are his laws for the physics and the axioms for his mechanics. So this is how he brings the two together. And this is, up until then, there are all these discussions, how do you bring the two together? But you have different books. A book in mechanics will have one set of principles, and a book in physics will have Descartes' laws of motion that are in some ways antecedents to Newton's laws of Descartes' laws of nature that are antecedents to Newton's laws of motion. So yes, the principles end up being things that the people in mechanics have authority, are kind of, trying to grab, have authority over. And Euler does exactly that. The law of inertia, can't argue with it because mechanics establishes it. That's the basis of why we should accept the law of inertia. But this is a shift again from physics to mechanics. But it's not, D'Alembert thinks that these principles should be self-evident. That's the way to do it in mechanics, a bit like in mathematics, but it's not obvious that that's the right place to put the laws. What's the justification for the laws? What's the epistemic basis for the laws is something that's going to get, disputed and worked on moving forwards beyond this. Yeah, the laws are a crucial kind of part of the argument for sure.
Thanks. So I'm getting a number of questions coming in about what I would think of as kind of other ways in which we might today conceive of differences between physics and philosophy. So maybe it's a common conception today that one difference between physics and philosophy is that philosophers aren't focused on empirical investigations in the same ways that physicists are, or some folks suggest that maybe philosophy is qualitative, whereas physics is quantitative. And these sorts of ideas don't seem to play a role at all in your story about the 18th century. So do you know what led to kind of this conception of the difference that we have today, or does this play some role in your story that I've missed?
It doesn't, because all of that is up for grabs during the 18th century. It's entirely unclear how these cards are going to fall out in the end at this point still. And there are people that so I already mentioned D'Alembert, for example. He's kind of has a rationalist epistemology. He thinks so much the worse for your science if you have to use empirical results to help you. And then there are people who are clearly philosophers who have an empirical, think that the right way to go about things is through careful empirical investigation. So it's not at all clear how that's going to pan out. I don't know. Other people may know more than me, and I should speak up if they do so I know quite a lot from the late 19th century onwards, and then all this stuff that takes me to almost to the end of the 18th century. And I have this gap that I have to fill. I don't really know what happened. And I didn't expect to be working on collisions and bodies when I decided to look at the 18th century. It was a huge surprise to me that this has such an important role. So I'm very loath to kind of say things that I think are probably right, because I kind of learned them about the 19th century, but they could all be wrong. So I'm not going to say, I don't know what happened to make the cards fall the way that they did.
Okay. The next thing that I want to ask that's come up in a few of the questions that I've got is there are a few parts. Maybe I'll try to keep these questions separate. So how clean was the break between physics and philosophy? So for example, one person asks, I take it the point here is if physics before the split was the discipline of philosophy investigating the nature of bodies, well, it looks like those kinds of investigations continue, at least with the development of atomic theory and the nature of material bodies as it goes forward. And so, well, there's part of it, but maybe we can say this if you want to answer that first. But part of the question is, well, wasn't this also part of maybe a story about chemistry becoming its own discipline as well? But maybe just more generally, does what eventually becomes physics keep this investigation into the nature of bodies in some other way?
Good. Yeah, thank you. So there are two things I want to say immediately about this. First, I haven't talked at all really about the kind of experimental strand of work that comes out of Newton's optics rather than out of his Principia. And this is enormously important for what will happen in physics and for what will become chemistry and this kind of thing. And I haven't talked about that at all. I've talked only on the kind of the mathematical strand of the relationship between mechanics and physics as it was then and what it will become. So that has to get woven into the story too, and that adds another layer of complexity that's important. A second thing to say is that sort of with every generation, so it's in the early 19th century with Laplace and people like this, there's a lot of interest in people that we think of as kind of sort of right in the center of even theoretical physics, who have a lot of interest in underlying matter theory and still trying to build, whatever is going to be the subject matter of physics out of some underlying, in terms of some underlying materiality. So that doesn't go away. So I don't want to say that. Certainly the story is more complex, but what I think is, one of the things that fascinates me about physics is the extent to which it's autonomous from philosophy, the extent to which it's able to generate knowledge without paying attention to its own foundations and without paying attention to the more kind of general kind of conceptual questions that philosophers are interested in. That's really cool and something that's really interesting to try to understand. And one of the nice things that's happening with this, just letting go that bodies have to be the subject matter, is it's giving giving physics its freedom to constitute its own subject matter, whether that be kind of mathematically, axiomatically, or in terms of some matter theory or some combination of all these. There's this freedom now, right? I'm not bound to say, okay, we're starting with these bodies and that's what we have to recover and these are the standards for success. There's this liberation from that seems only to happen in the late 18th century, and I think is going to turn out to be super important what happens to physics next, and seems tied to me to this aspect of physics that I really like. Sort of, yeah, epistemic power that it has.
And the other part of this question about how clean is the break between physics and philosophy. So you've given us some reasons why the split happens initially, and the question is, do you see these reasons being reflected in kind of current disciplinary divides today, or do you think the way in which we separate physics from philosophy today is totally different?
Yeah, no, I do. I think we inherit this very much, and I mean, that's something I still want to work through, but for the kinds of reasons that I just said in answer to that previous question, I think that there are all these foundational issues that are philosophical questions, as well as things that, yeah, just general foundational issues in physics, but the ability of physics to do all sorts of wonderful things without having to resolve those issues is, I think, part of what makes physics distinct from philosophy. You know, we're not like Mushinbrook anymore. We don't have to start our textbook if we're physicists by saying, well, here are all the regions of philosophy, and talking about teleology and spirits and moral philosophy and things in order to locate where our discipline is and say what it is that we're doing. We don't have to do that anymore. And that's, yeah. Okay, that was kind of flippant, but I think it's important.
Okay, going back a little bit to collision. So one person says, it seems like some of these attempts to grapple with the problem of collisions and moving bodies are still muddled together in physics education today in the way that, say, conservation of momentum and energy and ways in which we might use those laws are taught together, even though historically they may have been controversial. And so the question is, have we really gotten beyond some of these controversies and problems that arose in the 18th century?
So I'm not sure exactly what's being asked. So I'll say a couple of things, and maybe whoever asked this can message Ben. So already in the 1660s, we had rules of collision. So you could say, under certain sort of idealizations, given this input, here are my initial conditions, here's going to be the output of the collision process. And people worried about, well, what actually happens during the collision process to give rise to that outcome. And we've got, this is, I think of myself as an undergraduate doing my early scattering problems and things. We learned not to care too much about what happens during the actual collision process and to look at incoming stuff and outgoing stuff. That's going to give us lots of information. So there's something right and useful and helpful about doing that. It's also the case, though, that when we teach collisions, we teach them, very early in education, and we teach them with the same rules that Huygens, Wren, and Wallace came up with. And we expect people to think it's kind of obvious and easy, when really it's not. I mean, it's not even, why do we use spheres? I used Descartes' picture of collisions. These are cubes that are coming together. It took a lot to realize, well, this is going to help me if I just have point contact, but what about rolling? That's a really complicated process, rolling. What happens? So we're going to hang them from strings that we don't have, just working out how to handle even the most simple case of collisions. There's always stuff swept under the carpet when we teach these things. So on the one hand, no, we learned a lot. We don't have to, we can just teach these things and do these things without worrying about all this kind of stuff. On the other hand, yeah, we're sweeping loads of stuff under the carpet and it's really hard. And if you're interested in those kinds of things, you should peek under the carpet, definitely.
Okay. Okay, there's a little bit of a lead up to this one, but I think the question at the end will be an interesting one to hear your take on. So one narrative that some philosophers tell, and I think that this is something that philosophers say, is that philosophy historically plays the role of a sort of nursery for diverse sciences. And so philosophers nurture a certain discipline, but once they go a certain distance, the discipline has to mature and break off to become physics or chemistry or psychology or linguistics. And the idea is that philosophy plays a nurturing role. And so the question is, in your understanding of the splitting off of physics, from the talk, maybe there's a sense in which philosophy plays an important nurturing role, but also rather do you see it in, I guess, what you were just saying, as perhaps philosophy being a hamperer, so that physics needed to liberate itself, as you said, to kind of get away from some of those foundational questions and allow a different kind of progress to be made?
So I would be reluctant to tell any kind of general story about discipline separation. So there's always a lot of sociological and just political stuff going on when this happens. There's power struggles, different people have different skills and they're all competing for resources and things. So to narrow in locally, then I'm interested about, well, what happened in the case of physics? And it seems, you could tell a story of kind of, nurturing it till it got to the point where it could be independent, but that doesn't really tell me in virtue of what is it independence, and yeah, in what way is it independent, and what does that independence achieve? It doesn't give me anything that I'm really interested in philosophically about, yeah, what kind of independence that is. And as it turns out, in the case of the relationship between physics and philosophy, I'm sorry, that's my cat. This is like the typical Zoom thing, right? You have to be quiet. Shh. Sorry, now I'm completely distracted. In the case of physics gets transformed into something else as it separates from philosophy. So it's not that kind of physics just kind of nurtures it, gets it to a certain point and then says, right, you're fully formed, now off you go. Not at all. Physics has to turn into something else because of some inadequacies in the philosophers' own attempts to solve their own problems. And so the problems get changed, what counts as solving them get changed. So yeah, I just think it's with each case, it's going to be more, what's philosophically interesting is going to be local and much richer and more interesting than some general story about little babies being nurtured. Yeah.
And so there are a number of questions here that I think are about, so now if we've been talking about how it is that physics and philosophy split, then what's the role of us kind of bringing them back together in some way? So one question is, what's the role of philosophy of physics? What are the ways in which philosophy and physics overlap? And I have other folks asking, well, what about interpretations of quantum mechanics? Isn't that philosophy coming back into physics? There were a few other examples, if I could scroll faster. And so the question is just, I'd say maybe in general, do you think that we learn something about now this relationship between philosophy and physics by seeing how they split off? And does that teach us anything now about the ways in which philosophy might come back in?
Yeah, good. So So I don't think there is a clean separation. I think mentioned this before, that would be an oversimplification. So clearly at the foundations of physics, there are questions that are conceptual, and those are philosophical questions as much as they're questions in physics. There are also things that some philosophers of physics do where they just say, okay, I'm going to take some theory of physics, perhaps a current theory of physics, and say, what would the world be like if this theory was true? That's a kind of philosophy of physics that some people do. There's other kinds of philosophy of physics, which is working on these foundational issues, and some philosophers of physics work in physics departments, and some work in philosophy departments working on foundational questions that are questions kind of within physics. For me, my interest is slightly different. So I'm interested in so my questions are primarily philosophical. So I'm interested in questions about, the big question, what's the world made of? How does it work? That kind of thing. And then with respect to physics, what is the subject matter of physics, and how does physics come to be about whatever it's about? So for me, this separation is important because it's making me, it's helping me to look at the ways in which physics, as it separates from philosophy but doesn't become part of mechanics, has to say what its own subject matter is, has to make its own objects, right? Otherwise it's about nothing. So part of this is on the mechanics side with axiomatization, and you can trace that route from D'Alembert through Hilbert and people like that. Part of it is on the empirical side, how we get our hands on the objects that way. And then this interplay between the theorizing and the empirical kind of access to whatever it is that is the subject matter of theoretical physics. So that's where I'm interested in. Is that what I'm interested in as a philosopher of physics is what is it that physics is about, and how do we come to know things about whatever it is about, and in particular theoretical physics is what I'm interested in. So given that interest, then this particular problem, you can see why this particular issue of bodies is important to me. But yeah, I think philosophers of physics do a lot of different things, and some are people who are sort of primarily physicists but get into the conceptual and foundational issues, and some are primarily maybe philosophers, but for whom physics just is an important resource for the kinds of questions that we have.
Okay, thanks. And so there's another question. So this made me think of Locke's, not me, but the questioner, think of Locke's famous remarks that while Huygens and Newton were master builders who were going to build lasting monuments, it was enough for him, Locke, a philosopher, to be an underlaborer clearing away the rubble. And the question is, how prevalent was that kind of attitude, or maybe similar attitudes among other philosophers? And do those attitudes, you think, play any role in your narrative?
So I like Du Châtelet's attitude better. So she said that, yeah, there are some people who lay a stone here, others, clearing away the undergrowth or whatever, others are building a whole wing. And what she wants to do is to survey the plan of the whole. And that's what I like to think about as kind of one role for philosophers, and one thing that I kind of think of myself as enjoying doing is thinking about kind of the overall architecture of the project and what kinds of things it rests on and how secure those are and how likely it is that this wing over here is going to fall down, those kinds of questions. So yeah, I like her conception of kind of the role that she sees for kind of a big picture thinking philosopher. But this was also, different people are saying different things. This is all up for grabs at the time. How to think about this relationship, yeah.
Okay, let's see. The next question is, could this historical narrative have gone any other way? And so the questioner is thinking about, well, a satisfactory theory of collisions would have required electromagnetic theory that wasn't available to folks at the time. And so I take it the question is this resulting disciplinary split just a result of the order in which we happen to discover certain aspects of physics and the behavior of certain kinds of forces?
So I don't think that's true. And the thing that really convinced me was thinking of the extent to which even Newtonian physics could well have stayed within that conception of philosophy. So Newtonian physics treats bodies, it treats planets, it seems completely within the domain of how physics was being conceived at the time. And Du Châtelet's account of collisions almost works. So she has a Leibnizian conception of forces. Bodies have forces, and when they come into contact with one another, so what it means to come into contact is an issue that gets complicated later in the century, but assuming we can have an idea of contact between extended bodies, as they press on one another, this force gets used up. And she has a theory of how those forces work out so that they fit in with her version of Newton's laws of motion. And had she been able to tie that, she hoped, what she tried to do was to tie that to things that are measurable. So this is where it comes into the Wies-Viver dispute of what the correct measure of the force of a body is. Had she been able to do that, and it wasn't obvious that it wasn't going to work out, there would have been an account of how it is that bodies act on one another that would have satisfied the philosophers. It didn't work out, but it might have done. And there's some sense in which it might have done. And physics would have had to get a lot more complicated, and a split might have happened later for other reasons, and not for this reason. So yeah, I don't want to say that it was just inevitable that it was going to happen.
Okay, I've also got some questions. So about the role of rigid and impenetrable bodies. So I just lost the question. So one question is just, could you expand, because you said in the talk on what you mean when you say we don't have empirical access to these perfectly rigid or impenetrable bodies, and then because I'm guessing that part of the answer is that they're a kind of idealization, and so if the study of collisions with perfectly impenetrable bodies or perfectly rigid bodies plays an essential role in this split, does that tell us anything interesting about how we've defined physics as a discipline?
Can I go back to the other question just first? Because there's one thing I meant to say about that, and that is, and then I'll come to that, and that is that, so we're in a situation now, right, where there's a big gap between what physics tells us and the bodies of our everyday experience and how to recover those. And so I guess that the main point was, it's not obvious that that gap had to open up. It's not obvious that it would have to be so very, very hard to recover just the ordinary macro objects of our experience from some underlying physics and matter theory again, but the world has turned out to be that way. So that's one reason why it might not have gone the way that it did. So now to the rigid bodies and idealization and things. So if it's an idealization, then we should have some thoughts about how to relax that idealization and recover what we think the world is really like. And we have absolutely no idea how to do that from what D'Alembert is suggesting. So that's one point. So now I can't remember what the question was. Sorry, I'm gonna have to make you read it again.
Well, one part of the question is just to say, what do you mean when you said during the talk that we don't have empirical access to perfectly rigid bodies? And then do you think that there are kind of interesting things that we learn about how physics defines itself as a discipline from treating these things that we don't have empirical access to?
Okay. That's a really interesting and difficult question. So how we make the connection between our mathematical theories and the physical stuff that we take our theories to be about is one of the issues that's fraught in the 18th century and continues to be fraught from then on. The way that D'Alembert makes that connection is to say, well, I don't know if there are rigid bodies and I don't really understand how such things are possible, but these are the things I can theorize about. So this is what there is. And I am going to talk about bodies as they really are. And so they really are extended and rigid and all this kind of thing. And okay, so the ones that we see around us aren't, and I don't know how to make sense of that, but this is, this is how I'm going to make my theory world connection. This is the nature of bodies, and I know this to be the case because I'm a Cartesian. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is empirically, and then you can't have rigid hard bodies as the place that you start, and you better have, if you're going to use them in your theorizing, you better have an account of what the relationship is between these rigid bodies that you have no empirical access to and the things that you do have empirical access to. And people try this, and then other people are just like, no, if we don't have them, we're going to have to start somewhere else with some theory of soft bodies or elastic bodies or something like this. I think I must be getting tired because that feels like not a good answer to the question. So I took the question to point me towards this issue of what's the relationship between the mathematical theories that are highly idealized and the real stuff in the world. And that's a dispute at the time when we see the seeds of the different possibilities that we kind of work with now in play already there, but I don't think I can say more than that really.
Okay, there are, let's see, there are at least two other questions that maybe we can get to before we're out of time. So one question is just, were there other areas beyond these investigations of collisions that you think also contributed? I mean, this is your focus in the talk, but are there other things that you think are relevant, even if they're peripheral?
Well, there must be loads of stuff, but this is all I know about at the moment, is I've had my head buried in collisions for the last 2 years. So I wouldn't like to say there aren't, but this seems to me critical because everybody who's doing physics, even if they think there are other ways that things act on one another, they all think that contact action is one way in which bodies act on one another, and that's super important for macro-sized objects like us. It's not until we get to Boscovich and Kant at the end of the 18th century that people start theorizing in terms of forces and thinking about what does contact action really involve? What is contact? And that, this starts to get complicated. But notice now that if you make that move to point particles surrounded by forces, you're not, the subject matter of physics is not bodies anymore, right? It's point particles and forces. And bodies are things that are derivative. And so physics isn't, we have a different conception of physics now.
Okay, this question is, I think, a little outside the scope of the talk, but I'm curious if you have an answer. So someone says, I'm curious how you see this break between physics and philosophy relating to the Einstein-Bergson debate in 1922. And I don't really know anything about this debate. So, I mean, if you don't either, then you're welcome to pass. But if you did, I'd be happy to hear about it.
I know a bit about Einstein, a bit about Bergson, but I don't think I know about this debate. At least I don't remember. But maybe someone, if whoever asked that, can say, it was this one.
I'll keep an eye if someone wants to say more about this. But then, so there's another question here. So how do you respond to the idea that some physicists recently have claimed that philosophy no longer has a role in studying empirical bodies? So Stephen Hawking, Lawrence Krauss, and even sometimes Neil deGrasse Tyson. Do you have anything to say kind of in response?
if you use any concepts in what you do, then you're doing philosophy, and you need philosophy. I mean, just seems false and like, yeah, self-falsifying, these utterances. So no, I don't have much to say. I sort of, yeah, have so little sense of the amazing kind of conceptual work that goes on in doing physics to make physics possible, and to have no sense of how philosophical that is kind of spectacular.
Okay, I do want to, so there are some questions that that we weren't able to get to, but I do want to keep us on time because it's getting late on the East Coast. So I just want to say thank you so much, Professor Brading, for joining us this evening and for sharing your work with us. And I hope all of you will join me once again in thanking our speaker. So feel free to turn on your sound and clap if you'd like. I'm going to do so.
Thank you all very much. This is very much a live and ongoing project. Marius and I are trying very hard to work to get it finished. So I'm very grateful for all the feedback and input. It will be very helpful as we continue to work on it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Brading. And I want to thank everyone in the audience for spending a couple hours with us. We hope that you'll be able to join us for the next O'Hara lecture next year. You'll definitely receive notification. I hope everyone has a good evening.